Hello, Marion and Michael.
Hey, good morning, Vladimir.
Hi, how you doing?
Nice to see you.
Absolutely, thank you. Very, very good to see you too. I don't know if you remember, but we met in 2018 in Venice.
It
Oh,
was, yeah, at the Biennale.
At the Biennale, we actually walked around your model and spoke about, potentially doing the interview. I also did a book. This book, which is an architectural guide, New York.
oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
I included 3 of your projects there.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
We need to make sure, I think we have it. Does it have a different color or is it always turquoise?
It's this color. I did another book, which is blue, but that's on Chicago. But this one is in this color, and there are 3 projects. This book was quite special because, very particular because it focused specifically on iconic buildings, 100 iconic buildings in New York since 1999. And I included Brooklyn Botanic Garden and so the park, Hunters Point Park, and your building at Columbia.
And
Yes.
Bernard, right?
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Diana
Oh,
building.
yeah.
Yes.
We have to check. That book sounds very familiar.
And what is unusual about the book is that I gave every single building in the book a nickname. So your Barnard College is Cascade,
Ah.
and the park is Swoosh, and what else? And
Gee.
yeah, there is one more.
The Botanic
Yeah,
Garden.
the botanic is Serpentine.
Wow. Oh, it's so nice. I love those.
Thank you. We'll
Yeah.
Yeah, the point was to specifically talk about the iconic and how it really captured the imagination of architects who were building in New York in that era after a very dry decade in the 90s, when there was hardly anything built. And then the Guggenheim in Bilbao was one of the biggest kind of accelerators as far as the visual, but also economically, the world became a lot more kind of prosperous place, and which allowed these iconic buildings to be built. But what's interesting about these buildings is that many of them were actually demanded to be built as iconic in the briefs, and more so in New York than in other places.
Yeah.
So that was my focus.
What a wonderful thing, and to capture a collection so that one could understand a gestalt and not just one thing at a time. That's actually a fantastic way to curate the kind of insights and observations.
Yeah, and what I found that when I was asked to do a book on Chicago, I found out that it didn't work for Chicago as being an iconic, good place for iconic buildings to be built. So I structured the book about the idea of postmodernism, which was, it was in Chicago where modernism was dismantled with a much stronger force because Mies was there.
Right.
And there was a lot of him there, and a lot of copies of him. So even though those architects who came next, they admired Mies, but they wanted to establish their own kind of architecture, and they were very different. But what united them was being against that particular universal image. And I didn't want to follow that.
the big one who was
The
really
Tigerman,
bad,
yeah.
Tigerman, yeah.
Well, they all had to kill the father, right?
Exactly, exactly. Seen him in the Lake Michigan.
Yeah, yeah.
Vladimir, what got you into architecture and architectural history and contemporary theory? What was your journey?
Well, my journey was very unusual because I went to Cooper Union, and I thought I would become a practicing architect, which I did. I practiced until 2008, and then the financial crisis happened. And I realized right away that I had to do something else because I lost my job, and I just saw it that it would be years before I could find something else. And I met a number of people along the way a few years before that, and I started doing writing. And because of different publications, I was asked to curate an exhibition. Well, I started from the top. I was asked to help with Russian Pavilion in Venice.
Mm.
And before that exhibition was over, I lost my job here in New York. And so I decided to become a curator. And it's very strange to analyze it now because I didn't have any prospects, any projects, anything. But what I knew is that I couldn't continue practicing. So I started looking for different opportunities, and very soon I was introduced to the widow of the most prominent Australian architect of the 20th century, Harry Seidler.
You say Seidler, right?
And I was asked to curate his exhibition, which became a kind of engine for my whole practice. And I took that show to 32 different cities around the world in 20 countries.
Wow.
And along the way, I made many connections and started new projects. And eventually did a number of world tours. I exhibited the work of Emilia Ambas and a number of others. And so I decided not to go back to practicing. And eventually I started interviewing. I mean, I've done interviews from the very beginning when I started writing. And I just kind of accelerated that. I started working on books. And during the pandemic, the curatorial project was kind of put on hold. So I switched entirely on writing. And then I went back relatively recently. And now I'm quite busy working on exhibitions. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. What a great journey.
What a great journey. What an interesting journey.
So I want to jump to questions.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you a few things about potential collaboration later.
Good.
But Marion, I want to start with you. I know that while you were in high school, you were training as a runner, and you came across this wonderful campus, which you kind of fell in love with, and did even research to find out who was the architect, and it was Ernest Kump.
That's right.
And you arranged a meeting with him and consulted on, your, potential career in architecture. So this kind of is incredible, this kind of very scientific approach to, choosing your profession. If you could touch a little bit on that.
Well, what was interesting is growing up in the hills of Los Altos, Michael grew up in the hills of Rome, so we have that in common. But being a distance runner and in effect choosing different routes, you're putting in 6 to 12 miles a day, you're always choosing different routes. But Foothill College was not far from us. And it was an incredible paradigm. At the time, it had been the first one to spend a $5 million premium to put all the power lines underground so that you never saw the electrical lines. First one to use Japanese-inspired pavilions as in deference to the oak trees, which were the primary things that were driving the whole configuration of the campus rather than erasing what was there. And the net result was it was very, very beautiful. And so having, you know, father who was an aeronautical engineer, a mother who was a geologist and geographer, you know, architecture is kind of in the middle there. And we also had an uncle, Danish uncle, when I say uncle, family friend who we called an uncle, who was an architect and came to the States and had his own very small practice, but did very much topographically inspired, beautiful homes. So it seemed very interesting, and it seemed that what Ernest Kump had done was something that I wanted to do, which was to always think of architecture and site and landscape as one thing rather than as separate. And that's why I thought he might have good advice about the right school to go to.
Yeah, he didn't offer you a job?
You know, I was 16, you know. But he did say, you know, I told him all the schools that I had gotten cross-country running scholarships in. And he rolled his eyeballs and said, you know, what's more important, your days as a runner or your life as an architect? So
Fortunately, Marion chose architecture.
So I went
not
without
running.
a cross-country scholarship to UVA at his advice, where he said, you know, architecture and landscape studios are taught in the same space. Thomas Jefferson built a campus very much where landscape and architecture were stronger because of each other. And he had also taught there. And so the combination was a pretty compelling combination.
Wow, that's wonderful. And Michael, so you grew up in Rome and lived there until you were 15. So, and as I understand that as a teenager, you met a very cool architect and you kind of wanted to be like him. And, you know, I have something in common with you because I also fell in love with architecture in Rome, you know, under very different circumstances. I was actually an immigrant coming to Rome, staying there for 2 months. I was already a student. I was studying physics. And just walking around the city, one day I came back and I told my parents, you know, I want to be an architect. And, you know, nobody could understand the connection. And I couldn't either. But when I came to the US, that's where I started my research. What do architects do? But it was Rome itself that kind of started it.
Yeah.
And
so the city was the protagonist for you.
Yeah. Well, I would say in that sense, we both share the same levels of inspiration because, you know, Rome is more than a collection of buildings. It has a kind of dynamic that is so unique. And if you are at all interested in anything artistic, Rome as a city is a great inspiration. I remember two kind of particular settings that were highly influential. One was the Spanish Steps. In that sense, it's a hill, so both Mary and I love hills. But it was also a setting that would change over the course of the season, so we would go there as a family. And it's interesting because it's not necessarily a conventional piece of architecture. It's both infrastructure, it's about landscape, it's sculpture. The other setting is a Piazza Navona, which of course has sculpture, it has architecture, and it has open space. So I think those two really stood out, mostly because as a child, you go there and get ice cream, you know, you get many things, but later you realize how important they are. And that's also where my family introduced me to Carlo Pelliccia, who was engaged to my father's assistant, a beautiful woman named Lola. And Carlo was fantastic because he also encouraged me to draw. He had a sketchbook. He was handsome. He designed, as is often the case in Italy, he did a lot of interior design for the Vatican, also designed vestments for the Vatican. He was a very unique architect insofar as he, I think, embraced design in its and architecture in its broadest context. But I think this is a great way to introduce how Marion and I met, because my father was with the embassy, and when we came back to Washington, he helped Carlo and Lola, as his wife. She became the chair of the Italian department at the University of Virginia. Carlo came to Washington and worked for Moretti, you know, the great 50s, 60s Italian architect, on Watergate. And later, when Mary and I were talking and we were just starting to work together, she asked me, did you have a figure who was important to you? And indeed, I mentioned, obviously, Rome is great, but to see an architect older, he was probably all of 30 years old, older, was for me a decisive moment. I really wanted to become an architect for many, many reasons. And I asked Marion, and she said, well, she had a very, very influential teacher. So now, Marion, you can.
So the interesting thing is, you know, at UVA, I was a good artist, you know, coming from high school. That was something I excelled at. And we had figure drawing classes with this one Italian professor who, you know, Italian background, and he did the most amazing charcoal drawings. And I would do incredible likenesses on the top. I'd draw the feet very well, and I avoided anything in the middle because these were nude models, and I was a little embarrassed by the whole thing. And he corrected that and said, you know, begin at the middle, begin at the part that is the most interesting thing, where the light, you know, maybe the arm, the thigh, the breast are in an intersection. That's sculpture. That's the heart of what you should be drawing. And he demonstrated that. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh my goodness, it's a totally different thing. And he said, you might never get to the head or the toes, and that's okay. And so that was so inspirational that I took his class once for credit, 4 times as an audit. And so by the time it was my final year in studio, I took him as my final semester. And then he basically said, design your buildings the way you draw. Start in the middle, and maybe you don't need the edges. And it was transformational. I mean, it was absolutely, it's like you sort of felt like, wow, I get it, I get it, I get it. And it turned out that that very same individual, Carlo, was Carlo Pelliccia. Michael's.
Yes.
And this was a
Unbelievable.
surprise to both of
Total
us.
surprise.
And I think
Pictures of Michael at the wedding when he's a boy. You know?
I know, I was, my sister
Oh, funny.
and I were helping at the wedding of Carlo and Lola. But it's a beautiful story, and I think it also suggests the power of an individual, also the power of creativity to kind of link two people with very, very different childhoods together. And that's why I think your story is equally interesting too, insofar as the journeys we take. Only later, I think, in life can you really appreciate that.
Connect the dots, right?
You know, I love Piazza Navona because they had an ice cream called Tartufo, which was a very dark ice cream. I would go there, but also at Christmas, I would make these scenes at home, and I would buy things at Piazza Navona.
The creches, right?
Little nativity scenes, creches.
Oh, yes.
And, you know, for Marion, she has gone back to California with a memory of the beauty of these hills. And I think with time, you appreciate these influences in a way that you never do in the moment when you're 11 years old, 14 years old.
And Marion already said that what her parents did. And Michael, so your father was a diplomat?
He was at the embassy in Rome. He actually, I was born in Trieste and then moved to Rome when I was quite young with my father and mother and sister. He had no artistic talent, was very, very, what's the right word? Very formal, but also could speak several languages. And my mother also, she was originally from the Midwest and left America because she wanted adventure. But she, in some ways, was, I think, not artistic, but loved the arts, and took me and my sister to every possible church, every possible palazzo, every possible garden. And I think in that sense, again, going back to this this theme, Rome is a great teacher just by virtue of the DNA of the place.
And so both of your parents American?
My father spoke fluent Italian, came from an Italian family, and my mother was a young woman from the middle of America, and during World War II left to seek a career as a nurse.
And she met him there.
Excuse me?
She met him in Italy.
Actually, she met him in Italy, in Trieste, and then he was, they, I think, fell in love at an army hospital in Munich, Germany. So it's a very post-war romantic kind of story.
And so, Marion, you studied at the University of Virginia, then Yale, and Michael, you went to the University of Notre Dame and then Cornell. And you already, Marion, you already started talking about your, the architect who was your professor. But if you could maybe say a few words about some of the most seminal figures, most instrumental figures for both of you at school. At the universities.
Well, it's interesting. The experience at UVA was a fantastic education and training, and in addition to Carlo Pelliccia, the late Ralph Lerner was somebody you probably know from Cooper Union and then Harvard, and he was not generously disposed to anybody working less than 20 hours a day. And was very, very tough on, rigor and clarity. And it was really the combination of Ralph Lerner's sort of impatience and rigor and Carlo Pelliccia's appreciation of the sensuality and sculptural opportunities of architecture that I would say those two sensibilities were super powerful to experience side by side as an undergrad. And then in graduate school, at Yale, there were a couple of folks, there were many fantastic people, but there were two in particular who stood out for me. An obvious one is obviously Jim Stirling. And as a professor, again, he was somebody who at that point, it was his last semester teaching at all. And he was reaching a point where he was getting so impatient that he was inclined to see only 2 or 3 students a day in the studio and got in by petition and all this kind of stuff. And so you had to really excel to be able to get him to come to your desk. And so that was really interesting. And then his interest in the diagram and in the clarity was something that came through whenever there was a conversation, both clarity and surprise. And so he was very influential. And then, another individual who still remains a very important friend and mentor is Andrea Leers of Leers Weinsappel in Boston. And she was somebody who was less well known than some of the folks who were at Yale at the time, although she was probably the only one who saw my tendency to be able to just, produce immense amounts of drawings and models and schemes and jumping from one scheme to another. And in a sense, just missing some of that moment to develop things. And she was so tough and just said, if you can do this well so quickly on so many different schemes, what if you put all your effort into one and made it stronger and better?
Wow. And that's exactly what you do when I look at your work. Now, there are so many ideas.
She was just so rigorous about saying her firm was the first women-owned firm, Leers Weinsappel, that ever made Firm of the Year for AIA medal. Yet one of the things that's interesting is her curiosity was insatiable. She traveled to Japan. She taught herself Japanese. She has a place in Paris. She's taught at Harvard. She's taught at Yale. And she's endlessly curious and very inspiring as a model who both practices and teaches.
Wow.
And we both teach, obviously, Michael and I both teach, and that kind of inspiration has been really seminal.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think, in looking back, one of the important things about the University of Notre Dame was the requirements to take philosophy, art history, theology, calculus. So in some ways, it was less about the architecture and more about a broad, I think, ability to look at the world. And there was a third year in the architecture program that interested me, a third year in Rome. So I was able to go back to Rome through the lens of an architecture student. And that, I think, proved to be really seminal. Then I decided, after graduating, I was really interested in that. At that point, I was just completely on fire and was consumed with architecture. And someone suggested that Colin Rowe was a very interesting person. So I read everything I could possibly read on Colin Rowe, and then went to Cornell, which, as you know, at the time, was a relatively
You went to Cornell because of him?
Yeah. And I was in his graduate program. And but what I discovered, in addition to the fact that, because Ithaca is relatively isolated, you could spend time with someone like Colin Rowe. And it turns out, again, Jim Stirling, who was his student, if you remember the history of those two very important individuals, Jim Stirling was building a building at Cornell. So the graduate program was very small, and I would go over to Colin Rowe's house, and Jim Stirling would be there, both drinking an enormous amount of wine. So it was an incredible, highly immersive environment. And the other thing that I've found in retrospect extremely important is that it was the last 2 years that Mathias Ungers was at Cornell. So many of my classmates were students of Mathias's. So I had the opportunity to kind of, through sort of a kind of osmosis, to also appreciate Ungers. So it was an extraordinary moment for architecture at the time. And I feel extremely privileged to have been at Cornell at a very seminal moment.
So you were at the house of Rowe and Stirling.
Well, it was Stirling was the visitor to Colin Rowe's house, and often, when you would
And sometimes it was just three of you.
Sometimes it was just three of us, and sometimes it was five, but a small group. I have the distinction of mowing Colin Rowe's lawn. That was, I'll put that on my resume sometime. He asked me over the summer to help him with some things around the house, which was, again, an incredible opportunity.
Anything interesting they would discuss or say that became memorable from those visits?
Of course, gossip, as you could imagine. They both had an extraordinary interest in furniture. Biedermeier furniture, also at the time, there were a series of Italian designers, Sottsass, people like that. So it was a very eclectic conversation, rarely about architecture, often about politics, often about philosophy. It was the kind of conversation that would start at one extreme and discussing Mises' chair against a chair by John Soane. And that was the kind of conversation which was completely unexpected, of course.
But what did you learn?
What did I learn? I learned, of course, that architecture isn't just about buildings. Architecture is about many things. It's about culture. It's about food. It's about wine occasionally. But also, I think what I learned is that the kind of conversations that I was lucky enough to listen to were extraordinarily expansive. And so later, when Marion talked about Stirling, it was rarely about doing this or doing that or doing a kind of architecture like this. It was about how to negotiate architecture in a larger political context. And so what I learned is architecture isn't about this, it's about this.
And before opening your practice, so you both worked for Romaldo Giurgola, Aldo Giurgola. if you could touch on his influence on you and what you learned from him most.
You know, Aldo, it was from Rome. And so I guess the thread of Rome carries through a lot of our, I think, our connections. And for me personally, when I was looking for firms to work for when I came out of school, I obviously had been very inspired by Kahn and knew there were very, you know, obviously that was the end of a moment where that kind of clarity and sensuality and essentialness came through. But then I saw the Canberra Parliament House competition drawings pencil on the cover of, I think it was PA or architecture, one of those. And the thing that was so striking was how much the image of the earth and the silhouette against the sky of architecture were so married for a cultural endeavor that was tied to a city and its identity. And I just thought this completely epitomizes the very values that I had hoped to find. So I applied every month for a year to that office. And finally, after a year, I was hired. And the great thing was that he was such a humanist and so intuitive and, you know, taught Renaissance history and in a sense carried the humanity of history, time and place through the lens that he brought to architecture, that you could just say by osmosis that value system, but also the depth and breadth of the insights that he brought to the work and expected us to have was amazing. There were a few of us, Michael was there for 6 years, I was there for 3, who could draw. And so he would actually kind of bring the people in who could draw to kind of crank out perspectives and really start to generate things in dialogue with him. So it created an intimacy and a connection of being able to start drawing something and have him saying, you know, I think that we should move these over here. What do you think? And it would basically say, we're moving that over there. But he would be kind enough to make it look like while you were drawing that it was perhaps even just your own idea. So the generosity of being able to work with and alongside somebody was a very powerful model and experience.
Yeah. I think I worked very briefly for Richard Meyer, and the economy was kind of crazy, and then was fortunate to get hired by Romaldo or Aldo, as we.
And you were hired before he did the project for Canberra?
Yeah.
So there was a different reason.
Yeah, it was a different reason, and I was lucky enough to help with some of the competition drawings at the very end when everything was kind of due. But to Marion's point, that was an extraordinarily influential project. To see it unfold as a design process, and to, I think, reinforce Marion's point, what I loved about that project was you couldn't quite describe it as purely a building or purely a landscape or purely a piece of topography. It somehow encompassed all of those. And the other thing that I think, just to reinforce Marion's other point, is I think there was a value in drawing. And I think part of it was we both realized that through drawing, we could communicate, just as Aldo would communicate. You know, and he drew very well. He'd pick up a pencil and say, why don't we try this? And all of a sudden, with few words, but with a very, very beautiful sketch, there was a very, very clear idea. And you could take that and then develop a dialogue with him. And in a way, that was a lesson for how Marion and I could work. If Marion would start a sketch, I could look at it, critique it, maybe add a few things, vice versa. The sketch then became a kind of, became our language. Our shared language.
We actually discovered that we're both left-handed. So when we were shading drawings, the backward angle would not have been reproducible if one of us was left-handed or right-handed. And our very first collaboration was the vacant lots ideas competition, if you will, sponsored by the Architectural League. And I was working on the museum for Volvo in Sweden for Mitchell Giurgola. I did my drawing in Sweden, and Michael did his drawing in New York, and nobody knows whose drawing is which. And that was our very first moment, thinking we could kind of, you know, do this collaboration.
Well,
in a
the
way that
interesting,
would work.
the interesting thing is, after I left, both of us had fantasies of starting our own office independent of each other, with the idea that we would be, in a way, the solo authors of work, us. And really, quite by accident, we did a couple pro bono projects. We have the Architectural League to thank for, I think, putting forward really interesting questions for architecture at the time. And we found that we could actually do very, very good work, still retain a level of authorship, but it was enriched by our collaborative interactions. And maybe like two musicians, when they play well together, the piece itself becomes the protagonist. And through a series of pro bono projects, we did the vacant lots, then we did a study for the new schools. And then there was Columbus Circle was.
Oh, the competition.
Yeah, yep, at the Urban Center. And so suddenly, without thinking about forming a practice, we entered a competition for a women's memorial at Arlington.
So that was 87, right?
That was 87, 88, right?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
And I was teaching at New York Institute of Technology. Marion was teaching at the University of Maryland. Somehow we were sharing drawings. And it actually turned out that my mother, who was an Army nurse, said to me and to Marion, you have to enter this competition.
Oh, so she suggested, okay.
Yeah. She said, and at the time, if you were pregnant, you were dismissed. And
From the military, yeah.
She had a very, very successful career as a woman nurse and highly decorated, but that came to a quick ending. So she said that I needed to rectify the fact that due to my being born, her career came to an end. And then she turned to Marion and said, you're a promising young woman architect. This is a chance for you to push what was then a very male-oriented profession forward. So we kind of entered the competition not knowing much of how it would happen, but we enjoyed working together. And we were fortunate, we won the first phase. It was a completely blind competition. And then won the second phase. And suddenly, you could tell the story, General Vaught was our client.
General Vaught was awesome. I mean, she was just this two-star general woman who
Brilliant.
had bluffed her way into even getting this piece of property from, Park Service, and it's kind of amazing, but in Washington, it was incredible. But she asked us, did we have a firm and did we need a partner? And we kind of faked that we had a firm. We kind of whipped out, cards that were created by a graphic designer who we shared space with. And she said, do you think you need a partner on this? And we said, no, we think we could do it ourselves. And she said, all right then. And, she asked, have we ever done anything like this before? And we said, no. She said, all right then. And, that the fact that she entrusted us as basically kids who'd never done a project before to do this on our own.
This was an international competition, right?
It was a national competition, and there were, I think, a little over 140 entries. And so we were lucky, to be able to,
Any famous architects competing?
I'm trying to think.
I don't remember. No one like a Foster or anyone like that. There were a few names that have come and gone, but
Because once you won, this became a well-publicized project, right?
The foundation of our practice, effectively.
Yeah.
And then we won the Olympia Fields Park and Community Center right after that, and that was international. And there, I think there was over 200 entries, and it was another crazy one where we were lucky enough to win. And it was the two of them side by side that were both our first projects and our first built works.
What's the name of the second one?
The Olympia Fields Park and Community Center.
It was called
Oh.
The New American Green was the name of the competition.
Oh, so yes, New American Green. So this is outside of Chicago.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. What was interesting.
Was it built?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, in our first book, there are
Site-specific
photos
photos.
of it.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, Vladimir, is that was a project that was both landscape and architecture. And in a way, it further cemented our interest in seeing these two worlds as synthetic. And it forced us to become very good at grading, very good at infrastructural water management.
Water detention, water
Waters,
retention, all of that infrastructural stuff. We had to become instant experts on, you know, the flooding had just happened and our site all of a sudden had to inherit flooding from 3 neighborhoods with a higher water retention and detention set of requirements. So all of a sudden that drove the thinking and the planning for this kind of temporal water management narrative.
When you describe your work, you use such words and phrases as provocations, frictions, unfolding, hybridity, and simultaneity, inhabitable typography, choreography, and seduction, drifting symmetries, beyond project boundaries, amplifying landscape, identity, reciprocal horizons, delaying conclusions, and the fantasy of the future. What would you say is your work about, and what kind of architecture do you try to achieve?
Wow, you just,
That's a tough one.
it was interesting. You just identified a collection of words. And what's interesting is that for us, it's never about one thing, but it's really trying to find the essence or the essential nature of a place and a provocation and allow surprise and, in a sense, something compelling that you when you go to the place and you see it built, you can't imagine that it was never there before. And somehow it makes sense of everything around it and draws it in, shapes and reshapes the world it enters. So the reciprocity and the expression together are preoccupations that carry us forward all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I think to Marion's point, I think we try to find the DNA in a project. You know, that essential quality. We love the idea. For example, you used a series of nicknames for our buildings that describe the DNA in very effective ways. So we're gonna borrow some of those. But it allows, in your case, or in the case of someone who doesn't know anything about architecture, to quickly recognize the DNA of a project and to have it embedded in their memory. For us, that's probably one of the characteristics of good architecture, good design. The other thing that Marion and I have always been interested in is, obviously there's the kind of reciprocity between open space, landscape, and architecture, but we've always been interested in projects that don't have clear definitions. So the Women's Memorial was not only a memorial, but it housed an exhibition program and offices. So it had a hybrid quality. The Seattle Olympic Sculpture Park, as you know, is a very hybrid project. It's, you know, as someone called it, it's, you know, one of the best examples of landscape urbanism. It's architecture, it's landscape, it's ecology. We always, I think, gravitate toward projects that have this interesting ambiguity and maybe have an interesting question that's being asked. I don't know how to kind of frame it more elegantly, but there's something about the project that I think has always drawn us, where it's a hybrid kind of condition.
I think to add to what Michael's saying, we've only done one private home, for instance, and we haven't.
We'd love to do another
Right.
one, by the way.
We'd love to do another one, but we haven't done corporate projects per se. And I think
No.
a lot of it has to do with our commitment to the public realm and an interest in seeing the possibility of all our projects having a public dimension, because what drew us together in the first place, those two projects in Harlem that we worked on together through the Architectural League, was the fact that it troubled us that architecture was somehow reserved for those who had the means to ask for it and pay for it. But its purpose should be far larger than that. And, you know, if you spent time in Rome and other cities, you know that somehow this had a larger impact on the experience of being a citizen of a city. So our sense is that architecture has a citizenship as a place and as a destination, and that has always been a motivation for us.
And Michael, you compared Spanish Steps with an ascending garden, and you mentioned Spanish Steps before. So there are a number of projects that were influenced, I think, directly by Spanish Steps, a number of your own projects. If you could talk about that and some other inspirations for you in your work.
Sure, sure. Well, I think the idea of the Spanish Steps, not just literally the tilted plane, it has an idea of topography. So that idea of topography you could see in how you move across Seattle, which visually is very, very different. But the other aspect of the Spanish Steps that's very meaningful to Mary and I, and we went back recently, a couple of years ago when we were at the American Academy, and carefully mapped how you move. There is a very literal choreography. And that choreography, for example, was very important in our Brooklyn Botanic Garden, where you slide through the building around. So it's not literally the Spanish Steps insofar as lots of horizontal travertine steps, but those two elements, negotiating topography and doing it in a way that is so unique, because on one hand, you could think of the Spanish Steps as a piece of infrastructure, right? You know, when the plan of Rome was being developed, it was connecting two very important places. But also, there's something about moving through the Spanish Steps that Mary and I felt very, very personally inspired by, which is the kind of, your body moves through space. There's a kind of a seduction to how you move through the Spanish Steps. There's a choreography to it. And I think that sense of how you move through the promenade, to use Le Corbusier's term, is very important in our projects. And you could probably pick up a few projects where that resonates, no?
I mean, what's super interesting is that we're literally putting the finishing touches on our next book called Drifting Symmetries. And it really emerged from our sense that so many famous works of architecture have all been defined by polishing the top of the architectural pyramid and losing track of how they connect to their settings and how they are transformed by and actually transformed through their engagement with those places. And so we identified a series of projects that have been compelling. Spanish Steps are one, but also Agrasan Kiboli Stepwell in New Delhi, India, for instance, which is carved into the earth and creates this extraordinary place that all of a sudden has acoustical, aquatic, and social dimensions. And, you know, again, that's sort of finding a space through carving in, and obviously our preoccupation with topography is layered over time. But the other one you could also think about is the elevated promenade of the Carpenter Center by Le Corbusier, where the idea of pulling one person from one side of the street up and through a building to the other street, and through that experience and that elevation and that disconnection from the ground, find architecture in a new way and look at the city in a new way. And those are, in a sense, two extremes, which one is an invented topography that's aerial, another one is an invented topography that's excavated. And each one of those create transformations through that topographic change.
And among your inspirations, you also named land art projects, right?
Exactly.
Such as by Robert Smithson and Michael Heiser. So they are also important.
Spiral Jetty is obviously so remarkable in that it is of a sort of almost globally legible scale, and yet sometimes it's very present, no water, and sometimes virtually invisible when the water rises, and something that can become iconic and yet changeable is very inspirational.
You know, the other person who I think we had the pleasure of working with in Seattle was Richard Serra, who, as you know, passed away recently.
It's a series of torqued
Ellipses.
kind of ellipses, but you walk around them, right?
Yeah, or between them.
Okay.
One of the things that was, I think, again, in hindsight, so important to us was actually working with Richard to establish a setting for his sculpture. And over the course of several work sessions, I think we've come to appreciate how precise and how spatially sophisticated his work is. It's not just about mass or about shapes, but, you know, moving something, within fractions of an inch, for him made a huge difference. And those concerns are architectural in the most basic, fundamental way. So I think we've learned a great deal from the placement of things and their relationship to each other that is so critical and fundamental to his work. And that was a great lesson to be working with really an extraordinary sculptor over the course of several work sessions, long work sessions, relative to, you know, that particular project.
So that piece was made specifically for that park?
Yeah, he made two pieces.
He made that piece, and it was one was also in Switzerland, I think.
I think so, in Basel.
In Basel.
And what he did was he asked us to, in a way, define a space so that there was a relationship, and the space was lower. So the piece that he did was completely rearranged based on this sort of interaction with our edges and his piece. And that's where I think the genius of Richard Serra became very sort of apparent and important to us.
Yeah. Have you watched his interview that he gave to Charlie Rose in 2001?
Long time ago.
It's an amazing interview. I think it's the best by Charlie Rose. And, you know, the way he actually described his relationship with architecture, and he kind of looked down on architects.
Because architecture is not an art. He's very clear.
Yeah.
And he gets very belligerent about it relative to Frank Gehry.
But, you know, in the end, he gets inspired by a building, and from the very beginning of his life by a ship, and you can see it in his work, and his work would never be as profound, or it wouldn't happen at all without those
sources of inspiration.
Well, yeah,
of inspiration.
Borromini was extremely influential for him. I think maybe we were lucky because
everybody had warned us about him, and he was actually quite gracious with us.
Maybe he had reached a point in his career. We were young, so there was no threat, I suppose. We were very eager to enter into a conversation. We didn't have a need to, in a way, assert ourselves. So it was actually
it was actually quite nice.
It was really nice. It was a great.
There was an odd sweetness about it.
Yeah, great level of collaboration.
Given our understanding that he, you know, could become, you know, a little combative about architecture.
And you have said practice is a form of research. If you could talk about your design process, and how do you typically start a project?
You know, every project is different, but I think for us, the beautiful thing about architecture is that we're always at the beginning. Anytime there's a new project, we're absolute beginners, and we have to learn at the rate of a child. And one of the first things we do is research almost everything that's within earshot of it, from its geological history, its cultural history, its physical history, its political history, its formal history, its relationship to, you know, geology, geography, art, infrastructure, politics. we want to learn everything all at once, because it's the all at once that starts to have some intersections that become resonant and super interesting. And then at the same time, we're building just a whole bunch of models and trying to figure out the problem to solve that has been asked, which is ultimately often the least interesting thing. And so it's really trying to figure out through those explorations and the kind of making that makes you know something physical, and then the mental sort of mapping that stretches your mind, that possibilities start to emerge that have some clarity. And so it's, again, it's trying to delay conclusions absolutely as long as possible until there's time is running out, so you have to jump in. That has been kind of a consistent approach.
Yeah. And perhaps, maybe we seek out projects that differ one from another. Maybe clients come to us because they have projects that are unique, but every project, just by virtue of its site or the questions asked, seems to be different. So in some ways,
There's no stylistic
There's no-
stamp that can be carried from
Yeah,
one project to
yeah.
another. Right.
and so we're trying to learn at the rate of a child when we start projects, often making many bad designs. And maybe because there's the two of us, there is a tendency to generate a great deal of visual material that could be critiqued. And we try to be as generous as we possibly can, not only with each other, but with the questions asked. And for example, we won the competition for the La Brea, reimagining the La Brea tar pits, which is a current project. It's an extraordinarily unusual project insofar as it's both a museum expansion, it's a public
Research
park,
site,
it's a research site.
It's an urban place of fictions and realities. And
So there are very few other projects like it, which is liberating, but also terrifying too. So we started with many bad designs and many ideas, and then finally coalesced into something that we thought had the magic of the place, had, as we said earlier, that kind of DNA.
And you seem to be drawing your drawings at the, together, right? And they kind of develop simultaneously. And you said that drawings begin to have lives of their own.
I think drawings have lives of their own, and so do models. In that it's the mistakes that sometimes the bump, the smudge, the extra line that you see traced from the underside of the prior drawing, that all of a sudden we call it the eye squint test. When you blur your eyes, something clear emerges that seems essential. And then that becomes the thread that carries through.
Yeah, I think we favor, obviously, Mary and I draw. We love charcoal because charcoal's essentially imprecise, and in that imprecision, hopefully the magic of an idea can find form. But also our models are very crude. They're study models. They're not models done and fabricated for
We'll
an
do
exhibition.
those too, but
Yeah.
the generative ones are always kind of rough and ugly.
Just
Last
torn
night-
pieces of paper.
Last night, we made one from sliced potatoes and coffee filters and toothpicks. So, just to give you an idea.
That was Marion's contribution,
Me.
but it had within it a kind of germ of an idea that was very powerful.
And it has been said about your Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle that you conceived a landscape as a structural idea rather than a scenic invention. And you also called one of your conceptual sketches of the park Infrastructural X-ray. And I have your sketch here, and it's very much layered. If you could touch a little bit on that, the complexity you put into your.
That sketch was a really fun one to work on because it was really just a whole bunch of scratches and just sort of being reminded that there's the icon of the Space Needle up there. There's the water, there's salmon habitat, there's a trolley barn, there's a highway, train tracks. There were 1,000 things going through the space that had infrastructural demands. And the question was, how could we not cover them, but reveal the energy of them? And that's why we didn't do what was suggested, which was to kind of build a lid over the park, kind of like Millennium Park, but to actually create enormous directionality so that that tension and energy would never be lost. And that was what the kind of infrastructure was, not only the infrastructure of this new earthwork that started in the city and reached the water's edge, but also encompassed all the other infrastructures that were part of the site.
I'm really happy that you pulled that drawing up. Peter Reed at MoMA, when it was exhibited at MoMA, called it a talking drawing. And that drawing is really emblematic of how we work. It's a drawing not made to kind of complete an idea. It's a drawing that's very much the process of an idea taking shape. And we have many, many drawings like that that are incomplete, but they're part of a conversation, and you could see in a way the germ of an idea taking form. So that drawing, I think, really lovely that you pulled it up, but it does speak to also not only how we work, but how we see architecture as beyond just creating a building that is, as we just said, polishes the tip of the architectural pyramid.
Yeah, it's very notational, and there is a lot of text and ideas and questions that you ask right there. And you even, directed traffic, which way it goes, and, walking path, and it's all layered. And then I guess somehow the form emerges.
Yeah, and you could see it's all rough. It's just a whole bunch of partial lines that finally add up to something that, like charcoal slowly evolves into something that looks quite clear.
It has been said about your buildings that it is not clear where they begin and where they end. If you could talk about what makes your buildings common, what is it in all of your buildings?
I mean, all of them work very hard to actually draw threads from outside each site and draw threads from those buildings into their sites, and in many cases up and through. So that the common identity is that they can never be seen just as static objects, but as objects in motion. And, the whole idea that it's hard to tell where a site begins and the building ends is, for us, a compliment. We might miss the stellar iconic architectural cover photo, but I feel like we're more motivated by the things that reach more broadly into their territories.
Yeah, actually, a great example of that is the project, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, where in a way the sidewalk of the street slides into the kind of portal. You slide through the building, and I don't know if you visited it recently, but we've since added a very, very long belvedere, kind of
A
large.
1,200 linear foot wandering garden that navigates 24 feet.
So in a way, the building is inexplicably long, and we love the idea that you can't quite tell if you're part of the city as you enter the building and then become part of the garden, or if as you leave the building, you take the garden with you into the city.
And you said, I'm not sure who, you said the past can be reinvented. What did you refer to?
Well, I think that we are always drawing threads from pasts that may have been lost. And so at times we actually want to redefine histories in new ways so that they can come into focus along with contemporary futures. And so, for instance, Hunters Point South Waterfront Park, the wetlands had been eradicated. And so through this new fortified edge, that in many ways is almost like those medieval perfect cities fortifications, a wetland that had been lost could be reinvented.
And Marion, about the proliferation of spectacular projects that are being built all over the world, you said that the level of distraction is greater than ever. If you could elaborate on that.
You know, there is a kind of a culture of consumption now in architectural imagery, in part because media has made it so available. And that proliferation, I think, can add to a level of distraction that can keep people from looking at the essence and essential nature of the very things that they are working on in front of them. And in fact, works begin to look just the same all over the world because of that panoramic look through the digital lens of visualization. And so that level of distraction is something that I fear for the profession in some ways, because in fact, there's far more urgent and compelling and tactily present things within each project, in each city, in each precinct that needs to be looked at full on and with full focus rather than such active peripheral vision, undermining the uniqueness of what can be seen and created in a particular place with a particular set of questions.
Yeah, I think to build on that, it becomes, I think, a kind of crutch in a way to design based on how a building looks rather than how it performs or how it feels or how, more importantly, how it's experienced. I think architecture's great gift is its physicality. And we can create all sorts of things with AI on a screen that are beautiful and seductive, but you miss the ability to understand our world through architecture. And architecture's great gift is that it allows us to understand our world. It allows us to understand how the sun moves, how different temperatures could affect different surfaces. And there's a great danger in forgetting that that's one of architecture's great gifts. We can't compete with the imagery that's produced through AI. We can use AI, but in the end, architecture's great gift, again, comes back to how our bodies move through space, how we experience climate, which is, of course, another huge opportunity for architecture. The climate's changing in very, very radically challenging ways. And architecture needs to confront that physicality very, very quickly.
The final question I have is, what are your biggest concerns right now about your own practice, and what is your focus on right now? And do you feel any kind of shifts or progression or changes in very recent times? What are you mostly focusing on, and how do you want to progress in that direction? And what's the direction?
It's an interesting question because, again, since every project presents new opportunities, that then opens up a whole new world of questions that we might ask. But the thread that seems to be both common from what has motivated us before and what continues to come into greater focus for us now is looking at climate, looking at the environment, and looking at the strong connection that one can find between creating public architecture and something that has an ecological dimension that we're very mindful of. And bringing those two together and keeping those in our sights as we move forward, and keeping them in our sights, particularly as we think about our cities and our urban settings. Our resources are becoming fewer and fewer in the world. And so when we build, we need to be very, very mindful of both the resources we're using and the resource it can become after it is built.
Yeah, I think Marion said it very well. And architecture is a very impure art form, but it is an art form. So I think the challenge for us and our colleagues, and I think all the architects, is how to take these extraordinary and very real challenges and leverage them into something beautiful, something creative, something that performs in a way that causes us to see the world anew.
But at the same time, you know, all of that could be said about some of your very earliest projects. But, you know, learning from that experience, do you feel that there is a new character, a new kind of, you know, that you are discovering something new, or that you feel urgency to make certain adjustments, anything of that nature?
No, I think that the urgencies right now are very real in terms of what has been built and what can be built in the future. We're working on the embassy in New Delhi, India right now. And what's super interesting there is it's 27 acres, it's 2 city blocks. We're doing 12 new buildings in dialogue with a landscape that we are identifying as the campus coordinator, so that we can rejuvenate the best of what was there, but bring forward things that are very essential now in terms of how that community works. So recognizing that there are probably many more sites that are not tabula rasa, but that have had identities that need to thrive even while we are building. I think we're very mindful of a surgical and aspirational approach that in many ways we think might be the shape of much of the work we hope to be doing, which is really recasting these places so that they can become vibrant and vital once again.
Yeah, and just to maybe put this in perspective, the Olympic Fields project, which goes back several decades, was just at the cusp of the perceived urgency of flooding. The Mississippi had flooded quite a bit in the 90s, and there was a beginning. And I think in some ways we were sort of naive. We suddenly realized that that was a major issue that was going to shape our design for that project. And in a way, we backed into learning that through this sort of the emerging environmental crisis of water, we could produce something interesting, something that had some poetry, something that was unique. So in a way, Vladimir, that our concern isn't radically different from what it was 20 years ago. But I think Marion's point, the urgency that we are all now facing, is extraordinary. And with that comes an extraordinary opportunity.
When is the project in India going to be complete?
Well, we're going over there at the end of this week. Phase 1 is
Phase 1 will be complete in a year.
In a year, and then phase 2, which will have effectively the new
3 years.
Chancery building, will be 3 years. So
Yeah, it's in multiple phases because of the
phases.
complexity of the project.
Yeah, wonderful. So this is this completes the interview. Thank you.
What a lovely.
Vladimir, so nice to talk with you, and nice to actually see that thread all the way back to Venice.
Yeah, Marion, Michael, thank you so much.